7 countries. Right now, as you watch this, 7 countries are in the process of collapse. Not metaphorical collapse, not the kind of slow decay that economists euphemistically call structural adjustment. I mean real civilizational unraveling. And the first one on this list is going to shock you because it is not a war zone. It is not a sanctioned, strangled pariah state. It is a place the Western media has been calling for the past decade a success story. Let me take you back. Let me show you what was visible to anyone paying attention, not to the headlines, not to the press releases from Washington and Brussels, but to the underlying architecture of power, debt, dependency, and demographic fragility that holds or breaks a modern state. The patterns were there. They are always there. The question is whether you are trained to see them. We live in an era of spectacular distraction. Every week brings a new crisis, a new outrage, a new villain for the algorithm to amplify. And while the world is looking at the spectacle, the real collapses, the slow-motion tectonic shifts that reshape the international order for generations, these happen quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly they don't. Until suddenly they happen all at once, and everyone looks up from their phones and asks, how did this happen so fast? It didn't happen fast. That is the first thing you must understand. What looks like sudden collapse is always the last chapter of a very long book. Every empire, every state, every system that has ever failed gave decades of warning signals before the final rupture. The problem is that most people are not reading the book. They are watching a highlight reel. And highlight reels don't show you the rot in the foundation. So let's talk about the first country. And yes, it will surprise you. France, not Syria, not Venezuela, not some African nation the Western commentariat already wrote off. France, the 5th largest economy in the world, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear-armed state, a founding member of the European Union. France is entering a phase of political and social decomposition that by any serious historical metric qualifies as pre-collapse. And the reason nobody wants to say this out loud is that saying it out loud violates the foundational mythology of the liberal international order. The idea that advanced Western democracies are, by definition, immune to the forces that bring down lesser states. They are not immune. They never were. And France is the proof. Look at what has happened in France over the past 8 years. 3 consecutive governments unable to complete their mandates without emergency powers. A pension reform that triggered the largest sustained street mobilization since 1968, not for weeks but for months. An agricultural sector in open revolt. A police force that has, in certain suburban territories, effectively ceded operational control to parallel power structures. A bond market that is quietly, politely, but unmistakably beginning to price in political risk in ways it has not done since the 1990s. And an electoral landscape so fragmented that the concept of a governing majority has become nearly theoretical. None of this is secret. All of it is publicly available data. But because France is France, because it carries the symbolic weight of the Enlightenment, of liberté, égalité, fraternité, of everything the Western order tells itself it represents, the analytical class refuses to apply to France the same diagnostic framework it would immediately apply to, say, Pakistan or Peru. That double standard is not just intellectually dishonest, it is dangerous, because it means the warning signs go unread until it is too late to course correct. Now let's move to the second collapse, because it is, in a different way, even more instructive. Ethiopia. Here is a country that, as recently as 2019, was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. Its prime minister was celebrated across the international media as a transformational leader, a visionary, a man who had ended a decades-long conflict with a neighboring state and was ushering his country into a new era of democratic openness. The international investment community was excited. The development agencies were optimistic. The narrative was irresistible. 2 years later, one of the worst civil wars of the 21st century was consuming the country's northern regions. Atrocities were being committed on a scale that the United Nations, using its characteristic euphemism, described as among the most horrific in the world. Hundreds of thousands were dead. Millions were displaced. The Nobel laureate was directing a military campaign that independent investigators were documenting with the language of war crimes. What happened? Nothing happened that wasn't already visible in 2019 to anyone who looked past the Nobel narrative. Ethiopia is a federation of deeply distinct ethnic, linguistic, and regional communities held together not by genuine civic integration, but by elite bargains and historically by authoritarian force. When the force was relaxed, when the liberalization that earned the Nobel Prize loosened the mechanisms of central control, the underlying centrifugal forces didn't disappear. They accelerated because they had never been resolved. They had only been suppressed. The lesson of Ethiopia is the lesson of every federal state that has tried to manage ethnic pluralism through top-down political theater rather than genuine structural accommodation. It is the lesson of Yugoslavia. It is the lesson of the Soviet Union. It is the lesson that political scientists have been writing about since the 1990s. And yet, every generation, the international community rediscovers it with fresh shock, as though it had never happened before. Pakistan is the third country on this list, and here the collapse is unfolding in slow motion across 3 simultaneous axes: fiscal, military, and political legitimacy. The fiscal situation is not a crisis that can be resolved by the next IMF program. Pakistan has been in and out of IMF programs for 70 years. This is not a temporary liquidity problem. This is a structural condition in which the state cannot generate sufficient revenue to fund basic functions, because the elite that controls the state has successfully exempted itself from taxation for generations, because the military consumes a disproportionate share of public resources and is not accountable to civilian oversight, and because the agricultural sector, which employs the majority of the population, operates under feudal land arrangements that systematically impoverish the rural poor while enriching a small class of landlords who also dominate the legislature. Add to this the political crisis unleashed by the arrest of a former prime minister with a genuine